Many of Daniel Band's fans may not know how you started out. Tell us how you got started playing together, and feel free to mention any other bands that you guys might have played in.
Well, there were bands around before Daniel Band that were playing contemporary music on the local level here in Toronto. We had quite an extensive Christian music scene, and we had actually the room we're sitting in right now is the chapel, but one way in. The upper floor of One Way In, which is where we used to always play, and a lot of Christian bands were coming here and playing at a place called One Way In. The band that I was playing in before Daniel Band, I think this is Tony Rossi speaking, was a band called Harvest. And when I first played with Dan McCabe, as you know, the lead singer of Daniel Band, it was working together with him in Harvest. And what started happening is the guys in Harvest, if I remember correctly, started finding all kinds of excuses why not to take gigs, but Dan and I started getting quite busy with the Daniel Band. Next thing we knew, Daniel Band became rather a going concern, and Harvest just kind of fell to the wayside. And Dan and I finally split away, and I think we were both surprised, as was Bill, who also played with us, Bill Finley, how much busier we'd ever become than Harvest ever was. And next thing we knew, we were recording and touring and just ministering all over North America. And really, we just thought we were just going to be another coffee house band that played One Way In.
Or just another
part-time thing. Yeah, it wasn't like we ever planned, let's form a really big deal band and do big deal things. We were just friends getting together, and really what brought us together was friendship, and it wasn't like let's form a band so that we can do this, that, and the other thing. It was just we knew each other, and we liked each other, and we all had... we were all of one mind and heart. We all loved the Lord. We were relatively new Christians, and we were eager to serve God. We just thought we would do it in our own kind of humble way as friends, and the Lord took it from there. And we've always been in the habit of saying that the Lord just led us around. We didn't really go out planning or trying to do anything. It was God just leading us around. It was God's plan, and He did with us that which He wanted to do.
What I find amazing was when I think back, Bill Finley was really one of the guys in charge of the coffee house at the time. And
I was booking the band.
Booking the bands, and I played with a group called Manna at that time, a three-man band with my brother and another brother. And I remember Bill Finley coming to see Manna play because we were auditioning to play at the coffee house. And I was just absolutely ecstatic that I was able to play in a band that would open up for Harvest with Tony Rossi was playing.
Yeah, right.
I thought, what an opportunity. And I thought, that my life would be made if I could just, if the Lord would give me an opportunity to play at the One Way In coffee house. There's just nothing higher than that, And I remember opening night, Bill came and he saw us playing and said, yeah, we'll let you play with Harvest. And that's where I really got to know Tony. And of course I got to know Bill through him booking bands at the coffee house. So how we got started was really a strange kind of turn of events.
On Rock has a very bold lyrical approach, and Daniel Band has been known for a strong commitment to ministry. What was the cutting-edge ministry of Daniel Band early on? What were some specific ways in which Daniel Band was meeting needs and reaching out to the people, and did it stay the same or change later on?
Well, I think that we may have partially answered this in a few things that Tony and Dan were saying earlier, but the whole way that Daniel Band started out really was responding to a need. The band they were playing in Harvest didn't, or rather was canceling gigs because of some commitments, personal commitments that the guys in the band had at university or family, and as individuals they were moving on to other things. Tony and Dan, still felt very strongly about ministry through music. So I hooked up with them and we discussed it. Picked up a drummer and started filling the hole, I guess, left by Harvest, and really that's how we started as far as just filling needs are concerned musically, and the ministry. I mean, we started out as we started calling it Little Harvest. Remember that? And but we started seeing results. People were getting saved. Christians, recommitting their lives to Christ, and we were kind of, in awe at what God was doing through us.
When you ask about the lyrical content, there wasn't any kind of a plan where we said, let's try to be powerful. I think what we were doing is, like speaking for myself, I was a young guy. I'd come to the Lord at about the age of 18, and the group that I had, a group of Christians I had been involved with, had mentioned that if you're going to be a Christian, you should read the Bible every day. So the first thing I started doing was reading 5 chapters of the Bible every day. And which is kind of interesting because I used to hate reading. I went through high school. I think I may have read one book between kindergarten and high school. I hated reading. It's true. And then next thing I know, I'm reading the Bible every day. And I've been a Christian now for 27 years, and I have read the Bible every day for 27 years. I think I've skipped maybe a handful of days in 27 years.
Yeah, I always point to you.
Now, why, the reason I'm mentioning this is because when I was writing the songs that I had written, really all that came out was what was in my heart. Well, what was in my heart? I was being fed by the Word of God. So whatever was going into my heart, into my brain, was just coming out in my songs that I had written. And that's what's behind the lyrical content. It's just what was coming into me was going back out again. And as the Lord said in His Word, it will not return unto Him void. And it was feeding me, and through me, God was feeding others.
I probably say that's probably true for for Dan and myself as well. I have to admit, though, I don't know if it's a lack of faith or what, but I was always constantly in awe that, as you mentioned, point out what the Scripture says, it doesn't return void, and I was constantly being amazed that it was actually true, it was working.
I think one of the things that I saw change over the years, one of the things was said, like, how did the ministry change over the years? And I felt that Daniel Band always had a calling to preach the gospel with clarity and boldness. But I also found throughout the years, initially we started off doing that, really focusing mostly on evangelism. I found as the years progressed and the audiences started to grow, there was a large percent of Christians in the audiences. And what we needed to do, I think, I did in my writing anyways throughout the years, was start to address some issues that Christians needed to deal with as well.
Right.
I mean, our desire was always that Christians would bring out their unsaved friends to the concerts, and we started to hold them in secular locations, so that might be a little easier to do. But at the same time, we tried to feed the Christians as well as preach the gospel at the same time.
Well, that's true. It was the concerts. I guess fulfilled many purposes, in not just evangelism, but it was a good environment we were trying to create for Christians to come out and meet other Christians and have a lot of fun and burn off some calories praising God, and I'm hoping we did that. I think we did, and the ministry, as I said, I think evolved from just straight evangelism to evangelism, encouragement, and a safe environment for young people.
I've talked to a lot of people. As a matter of fact, I still meet people to this day. It's been 20 some odd years since Daniel Band started out. It's been a number of years since we made our last album, but I still talk to people today who say that the Daniel Band music fed them for like 15 years. I talked to a guy on Friday night. He said the song "He's the Creator" was his spiritual food for 15 years. I'm not quite sure why that would have to be the case, that he couldn't go somewhere else and get other feeding. I mean, I should have asked him that, but apparently that song fed him spiritually for 15 years. So it's interesting how God can take a little seed that's in one's brain and then just put it out into the world, and then takes on a life of its own where people are being nurtured by it. And we're now that's one story, but Bill, Dan, and I have heard stories like that countless times. And I think the reason that is because God was building His house. I've always believed that unless God builds a house, he who builds it in vain. And I already said earlier, this was God's band. God had His anointing upon this band. There's nothing special about me, or especially me. Bill and Dan are pretty special guys, but I'm probably the worst of sinners here. And it always surprises me that God.
No.
That God used us like this. And but I think God made a decision. These are the servants that I'm going to use. Like, pick Jeremiah or Isaiah, and they had their excuses why they couldn't be used, but God used them anyway. And we're in that category.
But I don't think it's without precedent when you were talking about somebody for 15 years being fed. Not everybody. I'm not promoting. One thing Daniel Band has always stressed is worship, fellowship, and teaching, and we're not stressing the fact that people can listen to Daniel Band albums for 15 years and get fed, but the point is there are those people who are for one reason or another they feel disassociated from church life, and my father was one of them. Having been an alcoholic for many years, when he finally got saved and started coming into church, it was painful. It was a tough thing for him to do, and he was fed the scriptures through a lot of the Christian television that was on at the time, and 700 Club for one, 100 Huntley Street from Toronto here in Toronto, Canada, and a number of other ministers on television. So it was these ministries were were weaning him off the old life and into a more church-related life where he had to end up eventually. And so I think in that sense, it's not a bad thing.
That brings to mind, I think, how Daniel Band, I think, stepped into a void. When I think about my own musical taste at that time, I had gone through high school listening to a lot of hard rock music. Before I got saved, I was listening to Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. I mean, I'm sure the list is longer than that, but really hard rock music. So when I got saved, needless to say, a lot of the stuff that was out there available for young people to listen to was sort of boring and insipid to me. So basically, I was just playing the kind of music I like to play, and I don't think I was alone when people started hearing harder rock sounds. Like I heard Res Band, for example. I thought, wow, this is a hard rock band. This reminds me of the stuff that I used to like to listen to, and but it's got a good message to it. And I think Daniel Band, like Res Band, and I think Jerusalem, another band at that time, stepped in and filled a void at that time where there were a lot of kids who liked the stuff with more of a grind and edge to it, but unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that we listened to, I think, had a dark, nihilistic message. And along came Daniel Band, Res Band, Jerusalem, and gave a message of light and salvation and hope.
So how did you guys come up with the name Daniel Band?
Remember reading through the book of Daniel when we were forming Daniel Band, and that's he was an uncompromising individual, refused to bow down to the whatever pressures were during the day or to whatever leaders, and he was true to God and to his faith in God, and refused to live any other way. And if I felt, in my opinion at the time, that if we were to have anyone as a model other than Christ, of course, it would be Daniel as the man of God for the hour. He did everything that we felt was appropriate for a believer in God, someone who is owned by God to live their lives. And it wasn't just because Dan McCabe's name is Daniel.
No, it wasn't named after me.
And it wasn't because
everybody asked me
because my son's name is Daniel too. But anyway,
I remember a good friend of ours quoting that little Sunday school song, "Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose, Jew, and dare to make it known." Yeah. And that's what we did.
Yeah, that's right.
Dan was actually absent when we named the band. Bill thought of the name, and then he bounced it off me, and I think I remember saying, "Yeah, that's the one we should go with." Mm-hmm. And Dan got back. So by the way, we called it Daniel.
Yeah, what happened? I was down the States.
That's right.
You
playing some golf.
With your dad.
Yeah, and I came back and I'm looking at the board at the coffee. I said, "Hey, who's this band?" The Daniel Band. Never heard of them. Oh, it's us. Oh, okay.
Do you remember being down in California and running into, who was it from Daniel Amos?
Oh yeah.
We were in what studio was that? It was near Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa.
White Field, I think.
Was it?
It was called at the time.
And some of the guys from there were from what was the name of the band? Chuck Gerard and the other guys.
I think Randy Stonehill was doing some recording at the
down
time.
there. Anyway, and this gentleman from Daniel Amos said, "Why don't you change your name?" And I said, "You change your name." He goes, "No, you." I'll remember that forever.
How much touring did Daniel Band do in the early years?
Considering we all had full-time jobs, we did a lot of touring, because a lot of bands, when you think of touring, you think of bands that's what they do. They make their living. But we had kind of a Paul tent ministry where we all supported ourselves with our day gigs, day jobs, and then we were out several weekends a year. I think Bill Finley especially deserves a medal because
my wife deserves a medal.
His wife deserves a medal because Dan and I were single in those days. But Bill had a couple of boys at home, just young guys growing up, and I think so. His wife Jeannie was really kind of holding the fort a lot of the time while Bill was out gallivanting around the countryside with
behind every great band, there's greater women.
That's for sure. That's for sure. But we were, I don't,
band, that is. Guy band.
Yeah. I think by the normal standards, if you were to compare us to, I don't know, some famous secular
Mylon Lefevre.
Mylon Lefevre, or some band that was really out there doing it. Actually, in those days, a band that was doing a lot of touring was. I have their faces in my mind's eye. Christian band. We played with them. We shared a couple of. We did festivals with them. Usually just the two guys, DeGarmo and Key.
Oh, yeah.
If you were to compare us to DeGarmo and Key, I think they were just always, doing a lot of playing. They were professional from the word go. We probably weren't touring that much in comparison, but when you add our touring time to our day job time, we were very, very busy individuals in those days.
Now, would you consider the playing we did locally here in Southern Ontario as touring?
Somewhat.
Because the first years we were playing we weren't recording, and we were playing, I think, according to some, we were doing about 80, at some point, 80 gigs a year.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, maybe even by any standard, we were touring a lot. But,
when we started doing albums, though, we played fewer, but they were bigger and farther away.
But I think something that maybe people don't realize about Daniel Band is we never were a full-time band. We were kind of a full-time, part-time band.
We never were.
Or a part-time, full-time band. But we were a very busy band, nevertheless, and we covered a lot of ground because in those days people were willing to pay for flight tickets for us. So we would cover 2,000-3,000 miles in a weekend and be back to work on Monday morning. And this was a common occurrence. We live in Toronto, Canada, Ontario, which is right off Lake Ontario there. And we'd be in California one weekend, New Mexico another, Texas another, West Virginia, wherever, Washington State.
And we're big tech.
So we were, we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I remember at work too. They were always kind of amused by the whole thing. I'll be at work on Friday, and they said, "So where are you going this weekend?" I'm going to Dallas. See you on Monday. And they just couldn't believe that we would be able to do that, which was really pretty remarkable at the time. It was pretty exciting, and like Tony said, we covered a lot of miles in a very short period of time.
How did Daniel Band go about getting their original record contract? It wasn't like Christian hard rock bands were getting signed to Christian labels all over the place. Besides Resurrection Band, I can't even think of another Christian hard rock band that was playing, let alone signed.
I think the answer for this question may stem back to some earlier questions, but Dan and Tony can jump in and interject if I get off the beaten track here. But one of these specific instances I remember of God meeting needs through Daniel Band is a family who had some teenagers who had really been encouraged in serving Christ through Daniel Band, and their mother had came to us and said, I want this for other families, and I'd like you guys to go in the studio and record an album and send me the bill. And really that's about how it happened. Now this family had the financial wherewithal to do that, and it didn't cost an awful lot of money. We had a lot of help as well. We had Glenn Kaiser and Roger Heiss come up from Youth of People USA, who were members of Resurrection Band and helped us produce that album. But that's really it grew out of a need. We didn't go running around looking for record contracts or financial support or anything like that. When we, as Tony said earlier, when he said this is God's band, it really was. And when those doors opened, we just, there's a door open, let's step through. And God literally led us around because we certainly weren't savvy in the business of music, that's for sure. And God protected us in many ways by some of the people He had us hooked up with. And even Dave Foley. Did you want to mention how Dave Foley?
Yeah, I'll never forget the night that we got together to have a meeting because of this proposal that was put forth to us. And I remember sitting around discussing it, whether we should even be doing this. It wasn't like it was a given that we were going to do this. But someone had stepped forward and said, I think you should. And we got together and had a meeting and said, is this really what God wants us to do? It wasn't automatic to us. We really had to work through and find out, was this the will of God, that he really wanted us to record an album? And of course, the answer we came out with eventually was yes, it was. And it proved to be the right thing to do at the time.
And we didn't have a record contract at the time.
No, we didn't. And it was someone who played the album when it was finished to a fellow named Dave Foley, who had connections with the Benson Company in the United States as a distributor. Yeah, Lamb and Lion, and they all heard it, and of course they loved it, and they said, let's get this thing going and turn into a multiple record arrangement. So
we were the first at the Streetlight Records. We got named to name the record label, and we were the first ones on that label too. So.
And to our knowledge, we were the first Canadian group that was signed with an American record label.
Right. Sounds right. I wonder if it's appropriate to mention the video at this point.
Yeah, that came up, 1985, when the videos were becoming quite popular at that time. It was sort of like a new thing that's come on the scene, and the record company felt that it was something that we should do. So people got to look at what we really look like live. And
we only looked like that for 6 months, by the way.
If you see the video,
if you ever saw the video, some things you kind of have regrets about. Yeah, that's one of them.
That wasn't our usual look with studs and whatnot, and dog collars, whatever.
But we
put
our hands.
The song was representative, though.
The music. Yeah, the music. Yeah,
the message was representative.
We were kind of going into an area that we had no knowledge of, and we put our hands and we trusted the people that were producing it, that they knew what they're doing, and hindsight is great, but I would have done it differently today than I did then. But
maybe a Bryan Adams look instead.
Yeah.
I have 4 kids that they've never yet seen it. Perhaps they never will.
It was professionally done, very, very well done.
It's well done.
Extremely well done. Yeah. Sure.
I would have been preferred to be in blue jeans and a t-shirt. Sure.
There was a television program here called Man Alive up in Canada. It's been running for many years, and was featured on Man Alive as far as us being a Christian rock band, doing the first Christian rock band in Canada to do a music video for MTV, and showing all the special effects and everything that was done. Producer Peter Cresswell.
Yeah, he also produced
That's Life.
Yeah, but he also did the documentary on Neil Young, Forever Young.
Oh, really? Yeah, why didn't I know that? Didn't realize that.
With the recording of On Rock, were you going for any particular theme lyrically?
I don't think there was an intentional theme, but I think what comes out of it is basically we can believe in God as the demons believe in God, or we can have a true personal relationship with Christ. And I think if you look at all of the songs, they're scripturally based, and they point to knowing God, knowing Him as your Father, knowing Him as your Savior, knowing Him as your Lord and Master. I think that's unavoidable in any song. I think that is because that is how we were conducting our lives. This is not spiritual pride or bragging. We were young guys who loved God, and therefore it came out in the lyrics, and we were walking with God, and hopefully we still are, and hopefully we always will, till the Lord comes and takes us. But I think that's probably, if there is a unifying theme, it wasn't planned, but I think that might be it. Knowing God, walking with Him as your Master, as your Lord and Savior.
Do you remember any specific fan letters or instances in ministry that really encouraged you guys and showed you that what you were doing was making a difference?
Yes. There's probably a few things to talk about. I'll just mention just one. I remember one year back in the 80s playing at a university. Actually, it might have been a high school. Anyway, it was a school anyway. Big school. In a little town in Ontario called Peterborough. And we had done this gig, and Daniel Band was in the habit in those days of doing altar calls at the end of each concert. And I think it was my turn that night to do the altar call. And it was a packed auditorium, if I remember correctly. That's not too clear, but what is clear in my memory is after I gave the altar call, nobody, and I mean nobody, came forward. If anyone wants to accept Christ as Lord and Savior, come on down. And we waited, and we kept talking, we kept waiting, and no one would come down. No one. And I guess perhaps the temptations to think, wow, this was a bit of a flop tonight, a bit of a spiritual failure. I mean, I guess human nature being what it is, I think there may have been a little bit of that going on in my psyche. But just by chance or coincidence or whatever, I talked to someone about 2 years after that event who said to me, do you remember you guys playing a couple of years ago back in Peterborough, in the school in Peterborough? I said, yeah. And he said, well, there was a young lady in the crowd who was our youth pastor. And she had told us that she was a youth pastor but didn't really believe in Christ. This was all just a big facade, and she was just doing it kind of as a job, and there wasn't any real viable faith in her life whatsoever. And as we were playing our last song, it dawned on her that, this Christianity thing, this thing about Jesus, this is real. And for real that night, she gave her life to Christ, but she didn't come down and tell anybody. I guess because she's the youth pastor, and they wouldn't expect her to do that. But apparently that night, her life turned around, and she became a real Christian. It wasn't just one in name or in looks only. Now, I didn't know this had happened, but obviously the Lord had used this that night. We had no way of knowing what was going on. You can't read people's minds. But so even sometimes when you don't think that things are going the way you prefer them to go, or there isn't a spiritual success, if I could coin that term, be surprised at what God is working out in people's hearts and people's minds, and that is such a
should be encouragement for.
Well, anyway, that was an encouragement to me, because I thought even when you think things aren't going well, they're going well.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Just because you don't know it, because you don't know what God's doing, doesn't mean He's not doing it. Yeah. Dan,
one of the times I remember is when we were played in Boston, and a bunch of kids got saved at the concert. And I remember going back a year later, and it was such a thrill to go to the church the next morning and see some of those same kids actually getting baptized a year later. And I thought, there's the fruit of the ministry right before your very eyes. You saw it. You saw it.
Yeah. There's one more thing I got to mention. We played in St. Louis once. And we showed up, and we were used to at that time, having a fairly elaborate, robust PA. And here in Toronto, we traveled with our own PA company that we'd hired out, and they were really, really good. And had great stuff and great lights, fog machines and
aircraft landing lights.
You name it, we had it. It was cool, right? So here we show up in St. Louis, and we find that a bunch of people have brought in their Radio Shack speakers and stacked them all up on.
We're talking literally.
Little speakers like from their stereos, and they'd stack them all up on either side, and then the soundboard was missing a fuse, so it had a screwdriver stuck into as the fuse, and it was tape being held on with tape, the screwdriver sticking out of the soundboard. We're like, what is this? What do we got ourselves into here? But we did the gig that night. About 45 people came to Christ that evening, and we heard back a couple of years later from the fellow. His name, I remember his first name, Dave. I can't remember his last name. He's a bald guy with longish hair. Dave, if you ever hear this, I'm talking about you, St. Louis. I can't remember your last name.
Fish.
You had the fish that if you stuck your hand in the tank, you'd have a half hour to get to the hospital. You're dead. That Dave. Yeah. Anyway, we talked to him a couple of years later, and he said that St. Louis was changed that night, because a lot of those people who came forward that night had gone on to become youth pastors and really walk with God and have a lot of influence in that community. And in fact, the city of St. Louis had actually undergone some change, stand back to what had happened that evening. So that was extremely encouraging. That was extremely encouraging. God doesn't need a great big PA and fancy lights and whatnot.
But it helped.
we liked it, but
we liked it, but he doesn't need it.
How were the members of Resurrection Band influential for Daniel Band?
I think what happened was Glenn Kaiser always had an interest and a love for Canada, and of course we're from Canada, and somehow I don't even know how, but the demo tape that we did ended up in his hands, and he listened to it, and he really was drawn to us and to the ministry that we had. And I think the boldness of the lyrics and the aggressiveness of the music drew him in, and also he saw, I think, a ministry that could touch another country, and that really was a great love for him, and a concern about the country of Canada. And that's how we ended up getting in touch with him and talking with him, and we asked if he would be interested in helping put together the first album, and he was glad to do it, and he came up and he spent some time with us here and worked through the production of it, along with Roger Heiss, who was the engineer for the Res Band. And that's how the relationship began, and we ended up doing a lot of touring together, and we would play together often when they'd come up to Canada. And there was a real friendship and a bond that was built that lasted throughout the years and still exists today.
As you reflect on the recording of On Rock, what were some of the more memorable moments?
I remember a memorable moment.
That's why you remember it.
Yeah, that's why I remember it. It's not a big deal, just a big deal for me. It wouldn't be a big deal for anybody else. I remember there's 2 solos on that album that I play. This is Tony Razzi speaking. 2 solos. One in the Sky, and the other one, I wish I could remember. It might be he's the creator. Anyway, I remember I'd never made an album before, and I remember being in the studio with a guy named Rene Broussard, who was doing the engineering. Everybody had gone home except Rene, who was at the soundboard, and me, who's in the little sound booth. And I couldn't see him because we were just hooked up by wires, and he was like on the other side of the building, and I was on another side. I was downstairs at the N Street Mission here in Toronto. And I remember being, I think, psyched out about the fact that whatever I record, because I knew this was going to be a record, thousands of people are going to hear this, and it took me all night long, the wee hours of the morning, to record 2 solos. Now, generally speaking, I would have recorded a solo on 1 or 2, 3 tries, whatever, but I was psyched out, and I've never had this experience since, I'm happy to say. But I remember like 7 in the morning, finally being finished 2 solos.
I bet you Rene was happy too when you were finished.
Oh boy, yeah. So there's just the 2 of us hacking on it.
And he was an accomplished guitar player.
He was a great guy. I think there was a couple of times I say, Rene, why don't you just come here and you play it and we'll give you a credit. But he said, no, it's your album. You got to do it. So anyway, they're there now, and I still think there's a couple of mistakes there, but we'll have to live with it.
Yeah. I remember how we had to go about recording that album. I remember we rented this 24 tracks
Studer
MCI.
Oh, it was MCI?
MCI machine. And I remember I had to go pick this thing up in a van, and it weighed a ton.
I remember that.
And I'm got this machine in the back of the van, and I'm driving down to the studio with it, and the board that we had down at the studio couldn't even accommodate the 24 channels, so we had to record like 16 and then kind of only listen to that many as we recorded the rest. We couldn't even listen to the whole program or the whole package until we actually got into another studio to mix it down right. So it was really, cut and paste kind of recording. It was really funny how it came about, and it worked.
And whose home speakers were we playing them back through? Mine.
Remember that? You took your stereo
in the lounge,
for monitors.
In the lounge, yeah. 60-watt speakers.
Almost like a home recording job at the same time, but it worked.
Yeah, that's true. And then we ended up mixing down at Phase 1 and at, there's another place. Can't remember the name of it out in the West End.
Yeah, we did a demo. Well, we did a fast mix.
Yeah, it was. You're right. It was just a pre-mix.
Because Glenn was asking for something he could listen to.
Then we went to Phase 1. That's where we met Mark Wright.
Yes,
who has been our
Mark
engineer.
Wright. Used him ever since.
Yep, that's right.
After the recording of On Rock was complete, how did the band feel about it?
Actually, we had done a demo of 5 songs before we ever did On Rock. Right. And I can tell you how I felt about that. I was impressed by it. I'm talking about the demo. I thought the demo was great. And when we made the album, I remember thinking we didn't keep up with the demo. Was how I felt. I was a little disappointed with the album. Now, if I were to listen to them back to back now, I'd probably think the album was better, I think. But I remember at that time thinking we didn't keep up with our demo.
Well, I'm Sorry was one of the tunes.
You're right.
And I remember a number of people, especially Tammy and a few others from back then, who liked that. But I think there are reasons for that, Dan, and you had a few ideas.
Yeah, there's a thing called demoitis too, where you go and put together a demo, and then you go and record the actual music, and oftentimes you think, the demo's better. You don't know whether it's because what you heard first and you grow accustomed to that. Or
I'm aware of that, but I think there was a nice feel in the demo.
There really was.
Perhaps we didn't capture.
Especially with I'm Sorry.
Yeah, there's a certain feel we didn't capture. So Now, On Rock obviously was well received. I think it was probably our best album in many ways. I think our most popular album we ever made. But it's funny that it turned out that way because we weren't feeling like we were. I once heard a band say when they finished their album, they felt like they were in a Cadillac with a full tank of gas. We did not have that.
We were in fear and trembling.
We were sitting, I think, in a rusty Volkswagen with running on empty kind of thing instead.
But I guess
I'm exaggerating. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't like we thought, well, this is really going to be great or whatever. It was just, it was okay.
I know what's going to happen now. Everybody's going to want to hear the demo we just talked about. Right?
Who's got it? That's the thing. Where is it now?
In the early day of Christian rock, many Christians were not only unsupportive, but often diametrically opposed to the idea that Christians could rock and roll. Did Daniel Band encounter any of this thinking? And if so, where?
We encountered it constantly. Everywhere we went, we were encountering it. I remember going with Dan and Bill one night, and we watched this kind of a Christian folky group, and I thought they were just amazing. And I remember complimenting them, going up and talking with them afterwards and chatting with them and saying, you guys are great. And he said, well, with this new Christian hard rock I've heard of coming out, he says, it's just terrible. We've got to do something to kind of, prevent this from taking over. That's why we're doing what we're doing. He thought his ministry was to prevent Christian rock from ever happening. And he didn't realize he was talking to a guy who just recorded it or played in a rock album. And so we had a bit of a debate. But that's just one example of how it didn't matter where we went or where we turned. There was always someone who had kind of an unkind word or was dubious about how God could use this kind of music. And
the audiences were large, though.
We had good audiences, and it's true. But it didn't seem to matter where we went. There was always someone somewhere that wanted to find fault with the notion of God being able to use this kind of music. I think it was assumed that because rock is what it is, it must be inherently a satanic art form or something. Of course, it's not. It's just music. It uses the same scales and chords as any other kind of music, as Beethoven or Bach. I mean, it's the same chord progression. It's the same 12 notes, the same major scales, minor scales, whatever it is.
That all the hymns use.
Some of the sounds are different because they hadn't invented electricity in those days. But I can imagine what Beethoven might have come up with, or Mozart might have come up with, had they had the benefit of electronic instruments in those days.
And overdrive.
So I mean, I think that there was probably much ado made about nothing, really. I think music is like everything else. This is an analogy we've used lots of times. You can take a hammer and you can build a house with it, or you can take a hammer, you can kill somebody with it. I mean, the hammer is just neutral, it's just a tool. And we took the music, which was just a tool, an instrument in our hands, and we used it for God. But certainly we encountered a lot of opposition, and that's why we came up with these silly analogies.
Well,
we had a lot of debating points a repertoire of debating points. I think.
But that's how people. That's how people. Well, I think that coming up with analogies isn't a bad thing. I know you're not saying that, but it's how people relate to imagery and to different situations through analogy. And I think analogies are excellent teaching tools, and that's why I think we developed them. We didn't come up with an apologetic for Christian rock because we felt we were on shaky ground and had to convince ourselves or something. We could see God operating in this. We knew the scriptures. We know what's right and wrong. We know that what is evil or bad is not bigger than a bread box and doesn't have a specific gravity of something and has certain dimensions. We know from the scriptures what right and wrong is, and music, in whatever form we believe, is not wrong. It's, as Tony mentioned, it's how it's used. People can be good or bad. Musical instruments can't.
I remember a few years ago, and I guess it was in the late 80s, I guess, there was a magazine that came out of England, and it was a secular guitar or rock magazine, and they did an article on the history of Christian rock music, right? And it was kind of surprising to me because it had us, Daniel Band, and Resurrection Band, and I believe Petra, as, quote, the grandfathers of Christian music. And like, I was only in my 30s at the time, made me feel kind of old, but I also know that any pioneer in something new really takes a lot of heat for what they do as
Bill
they're
Booth.
pioneering.
Bill Booth and the Salvation Army.
And we were no different in that sense, that we were pioneers, and we took a lot of the heat back then for doing something really radically different. But we also had a great deal of support from the local church that we attended here, from the elders at the church here, that took us on really as a ministry of the church. And they took a lot of heat for us on our behalf because of the stand that they took, that they believed in the ministry that we were doing.
We're not taking, if I can just interject before my Alzheimer's kicks in here. I don't think that we're not trying to slam the preachers or anybody who took a different, different thinking back then. I'm hoping that their motivation was good, in the sense that they really believed there was something wrong here, and we're trying to protect people from it. In my mind, what people have to do, and we're not trying to push Christian rock either, it's just that we've got to separate Christian culture from what C.S. Lewis described as mere Christianity, plain, simple, the black and white Christianity, and that's where I think people get into trouble, is when they have an idea what the culture of Christianity is like, whether it's your length of hair, or whether it's the type of music you listen to, or the car you drive, or whatever you do, and say that is for everyone. And I think everybody's got to understand, know the scriptures, know God's heart, okay, and make a decision based on that.
I think also we were basically perhaps reclaiming that which is rightfully God's. Music is God's. And humans didn't invent music, God did. And I think there's been a lot in popular culture where music is being used to glorify other things, but music is really for the purpose of glorifying God, including rock music. And I think we were just taking an art form, a musical genre, and using it for what it should be used for, whether it's country or folk or opera. I mean, music is to glorify God, and we were just taking that which was there and using it properly.
Yeah, it's to me,
God.
rock music is the music of the people.
In this case,
in this particular case, or of a very large number of people on this planet, and we're just taking we're taking the message for the people from God and putting it together with the kind of music that people really, really like. And it's a powerful combination, there's no doubt about it. And with it comes responsibility, because you've got the ears of young people. And let's not, give the impression that we were just running around willy-nilly, with rock music saying whatever we want. We took it seriously, and I hope people understand that. We were very careful to what we said and what we did. In fact, we used to come here to Bendale, and the chapel we're recording this in right now, and talk to the elders here about a lot of issues. Should we do this? Should we do that? We knew we weren't our own best critics, so we would ask people who were more spiritually mature.
yeah, I mean, God had told man way back at the beginning to be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. I think subduing the earth means bringing it under control, and God has put a lot of things on this earth that took thousands of years to finally get a handle on. One of them was electricity. I mean, human beings didn't really invent electricity. It's been there all the way along. And anything that's in rock music, and I think electricity is a big element of rock music. I think if you take it away, you're back to violins and
non-rock music.
Non-rock music.
Right.
But I mean, that is God's thing. I mean, we didn't make it up. And we flatter ourselves if we think this is a human, or if this is Satan's thing. Satan didn't make it up either. Let's not flatter Satan with that.
No, are you kidding?
Any element in rock music, whether it's the musical scales, the chord changes, the tones, the technology, I mean, that's all possible because of God, because of God's great mind and great creation.
Many Christian rock artists have been criticized for sounding like a Christian version of a popular secular band, and oftentimes second-rate at best. This was especially true in the early days of Christian rock and roll. With On Rock, you maintained a commercial yet unique and distinctive sound. How did you decide which direction to go musically, and what were the bands that you were being compared to at that time?
I think if a Christian says, I'm going to have a music ministry now, and I want to sound like that band, but that person isn't really into that kind of music, or it isn't the kind of thing that they go home and listen to on their own, they just want to copy somebody, I think that's going to come out in the wash. People are going to hear that and notice that. What Daniel Band was doing is we were playing the kind of music we like to listen to and the kind of music we like to play. We weren't trying to copy anybody. We were just doing what we liked. And that's probably why you get the impression or the effect that you get from that, is that you're just watching sincere musicians doing what they sincerely want to do and like to do. There's nothing in the way of let's be like so-and-so. Now, that being said, there are musicians and artists that we do like that influenced us. But it wasn't that we were saying, as Christians, we need to have a Christian ministry that copies that band. It sounds like that band. But influences that would include bands that like that. I know Dan liked Rush. Maybe I shouldn't mention that.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure you like Rush. I mentioned bands that I used to like when I was growing up. I wasn't necessarily a Rush. And I think Rush is kind of a Led Zeppelin copy band, actually, in many ways.
Yeah.
So, and I think that was one of my favorite bands. Like, I think they came out in '69. When they first came out, I was already listening to them. One of my buddies had bought an album of theirs, and I was a big fan of Deep Purple and a few other bands like that. But none of us ever said, let's copy that band and then let's have ministry. I was just writing songs. I'm sure that the influence of those bands are there, but it was just music I want to play and like to play.
Yeah, strangely enough, musical influences. I mean, when I was growing up as a teenager, I loved Leon Russell, who was a piano player, which really is my first instrument. I only played bass because no one else wanted to, Yeah.
I used to think there was something spiritually wrong with the bass guitar.
You couldn't find a bass player to save your life, So I listened to Leon Russell, and I liked Elton John, and all of this sort of the keyboardy piano players along the way. Tony mentioned I got into Rush. Well, that came later in life after I started picking up the bass. I started paying attention to what Geddy Lee was doing on bass. I really appreciate the talent that he had. He was a lead singer as well and played bass, and so he was a huge influence on what I sounded like and wanted to sound like. Sort of just from listening to it, it was a sound I sort of was drawn to. But strangely enough, while I was playing in Daniel Band, most of my musical diet was more quieter music. I loved listening to Chuck Girard. He was my favorite artist, and still is one of my favorite artists and ministers. Along the quieter piano players again.
And later on, you got to meet him,
and we struck up a relationship together, and because he was one who really influenced me in what I'm doing today.
Well, I noticed in the conversation, I was also influenced by many of the bands that Tony has mentioned, and the ones that Dan mentioned. I'd just like to throw in maybe Yes, and on the Christian side, Larry Norman, of course, and the early years of Petra, and Andy Stonehill too. But that you don't hear in our answer here too much about heavy Christian rock, because there wasn't any. The only other group that I know of at the time was probably Resurrection Band. I'm not really sure of any others that were in the same musical heaviness, if you want to use that adjective. And we were, as they said, we were pioneers in that area.
I always remember the feeling of kicking into some lead solo playing here at One Way In and being embarrassing. Is it okay for me to play an electric guitar with overdrive this loud in a church? I remember being genuinely embarrassed and worried about how, is this okay to do this? But
I even remember the debate, and when you mention that, it brings back debates about whether you should have digital delay on the vocals or not.
Right.
Talk about being pioneers. People weren't even doing that.
I'm sure people listening to this may wonder why you wouldn't realize that those are the issues.
And we had battles over that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I know.
Whether you should have reverb on the vocals or not.
You know what? I remember that. I remember that very clearly now that you mentioned that. And it reminds me, remember James Gunn, he was a preacher we had gotten to know here in Toronto, an old preacher, and he told me that way back in the early 1900s, they were preaching against sewing machines. They were evil. So, and I used to go, what the heck are you talking about, So I'm wondering if people listening, some of the young people listening to this right now would be wondering the same thing, like, those things couldn't have been issues, but they were, because it was new. It was brand new.
Oh yeah, there were definitely issues, and using I remember when we started coming out with Daniel Band paraphernalia like T-shirts and everything, and we had to really think hard about that, because that wasn't even being done, you know.
No.
And we were crossing a bridge there that really was not done by anybody else, or very, very few at the time. And you know, like we talked about earlier, you really do take heat when you are breaking new ground in new areas. Yeah. So we certainly did that.
If I can just put a word in for the conservative types who didn't want to move on, I think that's probably a good thing to have in the church, though, because it creates balance. I mean, you have some people who just aren't content with the way things are. They've got to just do some other weird thing. And you've got other people within the body of Christ who say, no, let's not change too quick. And perhaps that has a good effect overall, and there's it strikes a certain balance. I mean, there are certain things that Christians probably ought not to do, and we need those people to say, no, we shouldn't go in that direction. And I think perhaps, maybe I'm wrong, perhaps when it comes to the rock genre, there are instances where perhaps things went too far. Perhaps maybe rock musicians shouldn't wear mascara and look like women, because I mean that's scripturally speaking, men should look like men and women should look like women. Perhaps there are issues where, or there are situations where it's a legitimate issue, like careful what you're doing, what direction you're going in. So we don't want to sound like we dislike, or we think that those people are a bunch of fuddy-duddies and having a negative effect. But they probably serve the purpose, and maybe they reined us in a little bit, and perhaps even
a greater purpose than we think.
They help keep us on track somehow, and so that maybe we didn't go too far off. And actually, I think when we made the Daniel Band video, "Walking the Water," I wish some of those people were around telling me not to wear a dog collar with studs on it. Where were those people? I would have maybe listened. I wish I'd had some of that influence at that point.
Going back to what we were saying earlier, our counsel was from people who really, when we looked for counsel, people who really wouldn't have never put on a Daniel Band album or any other kind of album that even remotely sounded like rock and roll or syncopated or anything, right? Yet they knew our hearts, and they knew what we were doing, and they could see the results, and backed us up. But that's probably why, because they wouldn't have been on the set of our video.
The other thing I found really interesting, and Bill, you often alluded to this, was that because of the ministry we were involved in, people naturally assumed that we were very liberal in our thinking. And you couldn't ask for anything to be further from the truth.
And we thought Ronald Reagan was a communist.
I mean,
just kidding.
We were not at all liberal in our thinking. We were very.
Yes.
I don't know what's
we
the
were
word. We were very conservative in our thinking,
very
really. So we were just able to separate the two.
We were radical conservatives.
Yes.
Perhaps still are.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Except for Bill, maybe. But we won't talk about that right now.
Is a conservative. Okay.
A lot of debut albums show apparent weaknesses and room for growth. With On Rock, you burst onto the music scene with an album that was musically and lyrically bold, artistic, powerful, showcasing Daniel Band as an already mature hard rock ensemble to be taken seriously. How do you guys think that you pulled that off?
How can you read that when you can't read it with a straight face?
Yeah. Boy, are we fooling them.
That's right.
Thanks for the flattering question. I think something to keep in mind is Daniel Band was not a brand new bunch of Christian musicians when that album came out. Dan and I had played in Harvest for a number of years. For 4 years together, Dan had played in a band called Manna. Before that, here in Toronto, there was a lively Christian music scene that had been going on since 1972. And when Daniel Band first did that album, we had been playing those songs and writing songs for a number of years and performing live and becoming very comfortable and familiar with what we thought worked well with an audience and what didn't. We had a lot of experience before that ever got committed to tape and was ever put on vinyl record. So if we sound mature, I'm not sure that we do or not, but let's assume for the sake of argument we sound mature. It's because we'd had some experience. There was a little bit of seasoning that had previously taken place. We weren't what you can call completely a novice band really at that point, even though it's only the first album. There had been quite a lot of previous experience.
I think we got better playing live. I tend to think that with all the high tech stuff you can do in the studio, that you can, as we call Mark Wright, as you mentioned earlier, affectionately Dr. Wright, was able to fix a lot of the bloopers we had made in the studio, and you can do overdubs and whatever else you do in the studio. And but I think that it gave you a little higher mark to shoot for, and it improved our live playing. Which most people locally heard us live. Outside, when that album came out, people who heard us mostly it's off the album, and that's probably true of any band, I guess.
I think something that I liked about Daniel Band at that time, if I can speak to the guy within the band, is that there was a focus and a unity of sound. To me, every song on that album sounds related to the other songs on the album. It seemed like we just sort of found our sound, and not everybody in this life gets to do that.
No.
But somehow we had just been fortunate enough to say, this is the tone of guitars, this is the style of lyric, this is the approach in songwriting. We seem to find our own style, and I think it certainly shows on that album. There's a great unity, I think, in any way you can think of, you know. Dan also has a certain signature scream that he was doing, and I noticed he did it a lot live. It comes out a lot on the album. I think that's a signature of the album. There's certain that's one example of certain signature Daniel Band characteristics that are permeating throughout that whole album.
Something,
so I'm not sure why that happened to us, but it did, and I think it was a good thing.
Something that our manager Neil Delandria said comes back to me, and you guys can help me out with it here. That when it seemed that when we would get together and play, either in the studio or live, that the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. Yeah. And I'll always remember that phrase, because I think that's true. At least especially in this band, and I think if I can speak. What's the word I'm looking for? As C.S. Lewis put it, objectively yet honestly. That I think that there was a fair amount of talent in this band, but I think when we brought our resources that God had given us, musically and spiritually together, it was bigger than the actual sum of the parts. Neil was right when he said that.
Yeah, I know we used to often joke amongst ourselves that God must be supplying the hearers with different ears than we really have, because when we listen to ourselves, I remember, in the studio when they're isolating a bass line, I'm just embarrassed by how poorly I played. But when you kind of put it all together with everybody else, it worked. Whatever we were doing worked, and really
we were all loose at the same.
Yeah, we were all. Yeah, there was just a liveness about live feel to it, but God I just firmly believe that God just chose to use this.
Yeah,
and He did, and that's what the outcome was.
And we could have fought it and lost out.
Yeah,
but and thought like so many instances in the scriptures where no, I can't. I don't speak well. Let my sit there and but fortunately for us, in many ways, not just our audience and people who got saved and encouraged, but for us too, we learned quite a bit. Really faith building, seeing God work, and very encouraging seeing people grow. I mean, we got Jeff Bagg on sound here right now, and he started engineering with us when he was 14 or 15 years old, and he yeah, he wishes. But and just to see Jeff coming along and still being involved and growing in the Lord, and it's amazing. You see him from as a kid, and he's still the baby backing us up, but he's still with us, and it's things like that make you really understand that it's real, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, what God does is real. What you do with it is your own. He'll give you more of himself and all the resources you need. What you do with it is your own. Working out your salvation in fear and trembling. But when I see guys like Jeff, who's part of our own group here, speaks to me.
Where did the release of On Rock take you as a band?
I think the release of On Rock really gave us a platform into Christian ministry. I mean, we had a platform in the Toronto area, quite a large platform locally. But what On Rock did really was put us ministry-wise on the map around the world. I remember receiving letters from as far away as Australia and the UK and all in Germany and in different areas all over the place. And I think On Rock really launched that ministry from the hometown to the whole four corners of the earth.
Neil had his home phone number on the album. Can you imagine all those tens and tens of thousands of albums with your home phone number on it?
We didn't expect that.
We did. No, not at all.
It wasn't going to be any real huge deal. But that really sort of launched it internationally, I guess you want to say.
Yeah. But if you want to talk about places it took it, did you mention like people taking albums into prisons, right, and doing Bible studies based on the lyrics? Because of course, everything we do is based on scriptures, or as Tony said, something the Lord's been teaching us, and bringing in the music that the guys in prison could relate to, and having a Bible study based on it. And it was a little wedge to break the ice with these guys. And you hear all kinds of stories like that.
I think one of the other things too that comes to mind, of course, with On Rock is that one of the songs that was on Rock, Never Again, was someone recommended that we pull that song and hand it into a local radio show talent search kind of thing. This was like
Q107.
Q107 at the time was the major rock FM station in Toronto, and we said, sure, yeah, go ahead. And they took it down there and ended up placing third in the contest, which gave us an opportunity from a secular point of view. We ended up playing a secular showcase venue in downtown Toronto, and
that's something that's interesting about Daniel Band that I think needs to be noticed or noted, is that it wasn't just Christians who were aware of the Daniel Band, because I meet all kinds of folks who you won't ever find darkening the door, darkening the doorway of the church with their shadow, right? But they knew who Daniel Band was, because we've got a lot of attention from newspapers, secular television shows, that Daniel Band was quite well known in music circles in general. It wasn't just a ghettoized experience that we had.
Why was that?
I think the media was interested. Here's a bunch of religious fanatics, but they're playing
rock music.
But they're playing rock music.
So
then holy rollers, but they're playing rock music. They're not. We weren't that. We didn't fit the stereotype. And I think the secular media found that interesting, and we got quite a bit of attention. At least up here in Canada,
it would be odd to them, because
it was odd.
People have to remember, listening to this, that back in the late 70s, early 80s, there wasn't a lot of hard Christian rock and roll going on.
Yeah.
And they thought it was
and here's this rock band coming out with this message of Jesus. I mean, it was totally different than anything else.
So there was instead of highway to hell, you were going, the narrow road to heaven.
I'm a school teacher, and I remember walking into school on occasions where all my students had brought in cutouts of me in the Toronto Star, which is a local paper, and things like that. It was. I don't think there's a major newspaper in Ontario that didn't do articles on Daniel Band. I think just about everything that's out there.
As a note though. Side note, though, I used to come home from all these big deal gigs we were talking about with thousands of fans, and Jeannie would be there, my wife Jeannie would be there saying, "Hey Star, walk the dog. Hey Star, take out the garbage."
And people would come up to the door and get you to sign the album and everything else.
So there were lots of, we had, as Tony had mentioned earlier, we had lots of points at which we could come home and have a regular job doing and be humbled. So big egos weren't always a problem in this group.
I remember walking through the mall once with a girlfriend that I had in those days, and we were having an argument. We eventually broke up.
So that's okay, Kimberly.
But I remember walking through the mall. Now, I just think I'm a regular guy having an argument with his girlfriend, but next thing I know, this great big band of teenagers comes up and said, "Aren't you Tony Rossi of the Daniel Band?" So here I am having an argument in front of all these people that know me. Like it was
signing a few autographs.
So I mean, no, I didn't sign autographs. So there was a little bit of even almost losing privacy.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about we lost some privacy.